This is my AP research project on the effects of religiosity and literary interests, specifically in fantasy literature. So just to start out with a brief introduction, in terms of reading and religion, both are major aspects not only in my life growing up in a religious household and enjoying reading fantasy literature, but in basically everyone else in America's life. As a Pew Research publication finds, around 75% of Americans identify with a religion, and around 64% of those identify as with some sort of denomination of Christianity. However, that has been on a relatively slow but steady decline as people start to turn away from religion. This is somewhat similar in terms of how people read and literacy. Another Pew Research publication finds that around 80% of Americans, or 4 out of every 5 Americans, are able to read and are literate, but only about 25% of all adults actually report reading for fun, meaning that a majority of adults don't actually read novels despite being literate. And this is corroborated by that same Pew Research publication that notes that reading actually drastically goes down after people turn around age 14 or 15. Once they enter into a period of high school and college, ultimately they start reading for more academic pursuits and not so much for fun anymore. So therefore they're no longer interested in things specifically like fantasy literature, which is often seen as like a fun book rather than an academic pursuit. And it holds major significance in terms of how reading and religion influence people on like an individual basis. For example, reading influences our vocabulary. What we read translates into what we say. It influences how we say things. Additionally, it can also influence our emotions based on what we read, how we interact, and how we act upon different things that are going on within the world, and how we choose to perceive different things based on what we've read about things like history or fantastical novels about different situations that we've seen. It also influences our creativity, with different novels lending towards different parts of our brain and ultimately stimulating different aspects of ourselves and ultimately making us more creative individuals or less creative individuals depending on the type of person that you are. But religion also has implications on the individual person as well as the community. It influences our values, our moral values, how we think about big questions within our society. It influences our community because oftentimes those who are religious find community in things like churches or mosques and find a religious community with other people who are just like them. And it also influences our lives, how we live and how we orient ourselves towards different structures and different struggles that are going on in society based upon our religion. And before we jump into the literature review, there's a couple of definitions we need to define. The first of which is what reading interests actually are, and a majority of the literature base is based off of the Smith publication back in 1964, which notes pretty simply that reading interests are the overall literature base that an individual chooses to engage with the most. And additionally, specifically since this study is about fantasy literature, we look at a Felt study back in 2015, which notes that fantasy literature overall is fiction that relies on supernatural or unnatural characteristics or settings to achieve a different kind of story. And to put this into more pop culture terms, one can think of something like Harry Potter as a prime example of fantasy literature. But now more specifically into the literature review, there's 2 main lenses that the literature review is going to take us, the first of which is what influences reading interests. And within the literature community, there are 2 different things that people often argue about which influences reading interests more. The first of which is academics and schooling. So one publication back in 1995 notes that things like scholarly aptitudes in certain areas, such as aptitudes in terms of STEM, like science or math, versus humanities, like English or social sciences, often determine whether or not an individual is attracted to one piece of literature over another piece of literature. Additionally, another studies by Vaughan back in 1963 and that Smith publication in 1964 note that oftentimes what an individual prefers in terms of their favorite school subject would influence what they're interested in terms of reading. But the other side of the coin is about how personality and an individual's personality characteristics are the biggest determinant of what they're actually interested in. And this is corroborated by multiple studies which found that personal and behavioral characteristics are best determinants of what an individual is interested in reading. And oftentimes what these researchers argue is that an individual's personality determines what subjects in school they're interested in, which in turn determines what they're interested in terms of reading. Therefore, personality and behavior is the underlying reason as to why they prefer a certain literature base over another. Which brings us to the second aspect which is what influences personality, specifically about religion. On one end of the spectrum, we have religiosity, or the level of engagement within an individual's chosen religion, as a major influencing factor of their personality, meaning that an individual that goes more to their place of worship or interacts more with their religion would have substantially different personality and behavioral characteristics than someone who is less engaged with their religion. And that's corroborated by a couple of studies, both back in 1997 as well as 2014. But a different study back in 2019 notes that a better determinant of what an individual's personality ultimately looks like is the faith that they follow, and argues that those identifying under some denomination of Christianity would differ in terms of their personality compared to those who identify under a denomination of Islam or something like that. Meaning that ultimately religion has, again, two sides of the coin that would determine what influences an individual's personality more. But there's a clear gap between the two. In terms of religion, we've seen how religion influences behavioral and personality traits, and we've seen how reading can be influenced by those behavioral and personality traits. But the research has failed to create that bridge between the two, ultimately arguing that if religion is the underpinning of behavioral and characteristics, then that would be the underpinning of reading interests. Which brings us to the research question of, in the United States, how do varied levels of worship across differing religions impact the interest and level of consumption of fantasy literature? And given the research base, I've hypothesized that there would be a strong correlation between the two. Because if research has found that religion exhibits a strong influencing factor on personality, and personality is a strong influencing factor on what a literature base an individual is interested in, then there would be a correlation. Which brings us to the design and methods on how this will be carried out. Very simply, I've conducted a questionnaire, a survey, that is in 3 different pieces. The first of which is mere demographic information. This asks individual questions such as what their favorite subject in school is, what their GPA is, what religion they follow, as well as what age they're in. The second aspect of the survey, and as well as the third aspect, is 10 different questions, firstly about religiosity and religion, and secondly about literature and interest in fantasy literature. The religiosity section is conducted on a Likert scale on a 1 to 5 range, with 1 being strong levels of religiosity and strong engagement within an individual's selected religion, and 5 being a very lack of engagement within an individual's religion. Questions are asked such as how often an individual engages or goes to their place of worship, or how welcome they feel by the religion that they choose or choose not to worship, is something that would determine whether or not an individual has high or lower levels of religiosity. The third part of the survey is around literature and reading interests, and it conducts questions on 2 levels. The first of which is very similar to the religiosity section, in that it's on that 1 to 5 Likert scale, with 1 being strong interest in specifically fantasy literature, asking simple questions like, are you interested in fantasy literature? Do you enjoy reading fantasy literature? And a 5 being the opposite end of that, where an individual does not have any interest in fantasy literature or does not enjoy it. But the second set of questions also looks at the fluctuation of how that's changed over time. Questions such as, in the past, have you been interested or enjoyed fantasy literature? To determine whether or not an individual's interest in fantasy literature waxed or waned as they aged over time, or as they continued to be influenced by the religion that they practiced. And this method has numerous studies that defend it in multiple different ways. The first of which are multiple studies indicate that questionnaires, both about religiosity and fantasy, or specifically reading interests, are best determined by questionnaires determined by that Likert scale, 1 to 5, or other studies utilize a 1 to 10 Likert scale in order to best determine how an individual is or is not connected to the 2 different aspects. Secondly, much of the question bank was pulled from something known as the Value Genesis Project, which was studied by Lee, Rice, and Gillespie back in 1997, which looked at a number of Seventh-day Adventists and asked them around 400 questions about their levels of religiosity and religious engagement. And this was a very interesting study that I pulled a number of questions from to determine whether or not they would be useful in determining an individual's religiosity. Lastly, a question bank for the reading interests, some of which were pulled from this Tyrion and Dixit study back in 1995 to determine what an individual's reading interests were based, again, on this Likert scale. And then lastly, utilizing the fabled Pearson's correlation constant because given that this was issued on a Likert scale, the numbers were already in a numerical fashion, so all that needed to be done was to add them up and see whether or not there was positive, negative, or no correlation at all between the different values of religiosity and reading interests. Which brings us to the results. So firstly, what was noted was simply known as the control group, and this was all 97 respondents to the survey with their reading interest or fantasy reading interest level taken on the y-axis of this and the religiosity level taken on the x-axis of this. And as we can note, there's relatively zero correlation between the two. And in fact, when Pearson's correlation constant came out to around a 0.17 or around a 17% negative correlation in terms of how these two values were correlated between each other. So while this did indeed look at sort of how there was a negative correlation, how as one increased, the other decreased, it was marginal at best and very, very minimal. Given the results of this, I decided to branch out and take different subsects based on that demographics part of the survey that was mentioned at the very beginning. The first of which was based on age. The two biggest respondent groups were juniors as well as sophomores of this. And relatively similar to the survey, juniors exhibited around a negative 16% correlation in terms of their fantasy reading level and religiosity level. Very, very similar to the control group overall, indicating that there's really no real difference. The interesting thing came with sophomores that exhibited an even more marginal, around negative 4% correlation in terms of fantasy reading level and religiosity, which is interesting because this very, very clearly differs from the overall majority or the control group, which exhibited a much higher level of correlation, despite both of them being marginal. But the most fascinating part of the discovery comes in the second group, which was based on subject interest. Firstly, focusing on those who were interested in STEM, there was actually a positive 2% correlation between fantasy reading level and religiosity level, which starkly differs from any and all of the other groups in that it presented a positive value. And despite this value being very marginal, it still represented a stark difference from the others, which was incredibly interesting. The difference between STEM and humanities as well was also very apparent, with those who were interested in humanities, things like social studies, world languages, or English, ultimately exhibited a negative 22% correlation, which was far higher than any of the other values recorded, and was also starkly different from those who were interested in science or mathematics courses within schooling. So the biggest difference we can see here is the difference in terms of subject interest, which represented the biggest difference in the two groups that were studied, which brings us to the conclusion. So overall, in terms of the findings, again, they were split between three groups, all of which exhibited relatively marginal correlation in terms of how fantasy reading level and religiosity were related. The control group utilized all 97 respondents. The grade level group utilized the two biggest groups of respondents, sophomores and juniors. And lastly, the subject interest group utilized those who were interested in STEM, science and mathematics, compared to those who were interested in social studies, English, or world languages. And so, religiosity overall may not be a determinant of an individual's reading interest. And this is somewhat confirmed by a Tierney and Dixit study that was previously mentioned that noted, like most of the time, things like personality were not major influencing factors of an individual's reading interest. And given that religion is a major influencing factor of someone's personality, there might not be an extensive correlation between the two. So it is somewhat confirmed by other research. Additionally, it also confirms the fact that things like subject preference may play a much larger role than anything else in determining what an individual is actually interested in terms of their literary choices. Because as noted, there were stark differences between those who were interested in math and science and how their religion and fantasy literature levels were correlated versus those who were interested in humanities like social sciences or world languages. Additionally, while very marginal, they were indeed negative, which confirms a Zuck 1975 study as well as a Chan 2012 study, which noted that things like personality and fantasy literature, specifically in terms of things like religion, where there was a focus on how religious values were negatively correlated with fantasy literature. Granted, this wasn't about how an individual's religiosity level was correlated with fantasy literature, but it did look at how an individual's religious values may have starkly differed from those values present within fantasy novels. And there's numerous implications to this study as well, but the main one being that research should center around the different subgroups of individuals. As noted in the first part of the methods, the demographics section of the survey proved incredibly useful to draw different conclusions about different groups, and future research should really focus in on how different groups differ from one another, in that things like subject interest groups starkly differed. Things like different groups in age may have differed. Other things that were taken were things like first language spoken at home being English, Spanish, or another language. Those could have been modes of studying that other research could go into to determine whether or not other factors may influence this correlation level. There are, however, limitations to this study, the biggest one being a very small or relatively small sample size. Despite numerous attempts at outreach among school, there was still only around 97 respondents who ultimately responded to the survey. It is also only around high school boys, and a majority of those identified as Christian, meaning that there was only, I believe, 3 who identified as Jewish, 2 as Muslim, and 1 as Hindu, meaning overall these findings can be generalized to a relatively specific population, so a much broader base would be very beneficial in terms of future research to determining whether or not the conclusions are indeed accurate. And here